The radio crackled to life as Officer Chen checked her watch. Another hour until her shift ended. She'd been with the Lakeview Police Department for 7 years now, and most folks in town knew her as the cop who always listened first and acted second. Not the tallest officer on the force, but she carried herself with a quiet confidence that earned respect from her fellow officers and the community alike. Unit 14, we've got a 10 to 16 at Green's Convenience on Maple Street. Caller says there's a man causing trouble, getting in people's faces. Sounds like he's targeting folks who aren't from around here, if you catch my drift. Officer Chen sighed and picked up the radio. Copy that. I'm about 5 minutes out. She flipped on her lights but kept the siren off. No need to announce her arrival too early. The afternoon had been quiet until now, just a fender bender and helping an old man find his lost dog. But these types of calls always make her stomach tighten up. They could go from bad to worse in seconds. As she drove, Officer Chen thought about the last time she'd been called to Green's. Mr. Green was a kind older man who'd moved to America 30 years ago and built his little store from nothing. He treated every customer like family, which made it all the more upsetting when troublemakers targeted his shop. She turned onto Maple Street, sunlight glinting off the storefronts. Kids were just getting out of school, backpacks bouncing as they walked in groups down the sidewalk. A postal worker waved as she passed. This was what she loved about Lakeview. It was a real community where most people looked out for each other. The dispatcher's voice came through again. Unit 14, update on that call. Additional customers phoned in. Subject is getting louder, made threats to send people back where they came from. One caller mentioned he might be recording the whole thing on his phone. Great, Officer Chen muttered to herself. A performer. Those were always the trickiest, people who wanted to create a scene, hoping to provoke a reaction they could post online. She'd seen good officers fall into that trap before. She pulled into the parking lot of Green's Convenience and caught sight of a cluster of people near the entrance. Through the large front windows, she could see someone gesturing wildly. Her training kicked in automatically as she scanned for exits, possible weapons, number of civilians present. Officer Chen checked her body camera to make sure it was recording, then adjusted her uniform and took a deep breath. 7 years on the force had taught her that how she entered a situation often determined how it would end. Walk in too aggressive, things escalate. Too passive, and you lose control before you've even started. The radio crackled once more. Unit 14, be advised. Caller says the subject claimed to have something in his car. Unclear if that's a threat or just talk. A chill ran down her spine despite the warm spring day. That changed things. She requested backup just to be safe, but knew she couldn't wait. Whatever was happening inside needed to be addressed now, before someone got hurt. As she stepped out of her patrol car, Officer Chen noticed a young mother hurrying her child away from the store, the woman's face tight with worry. Their eyes met briefly, and the woman gave a small nod toward the entrance. He's really scary, she said quietly as she passed. Officer Chen nodded back, squared her shoulders, and headed for the door. In her mind, she ran through protocols, options, words that might diffuse rather than inflame. This wasn't her first difficult call, but something in her gut told her it might be one she'd remember for a long time. The bell above the door jingled as Officer Chen stepped inside Green's Convenience. The cool air conditioning hit her face, but it did nothing to cut through the thick tension hanging in the store. For a split second, everything seemed frozen in a strange tableau, like one of those old photographs where nobody smiles. The first thing she noticed was the smell, the usual mix of coffee and cleaning products, but now with the sharp tang of sweat that comes from fear or anger. Maybe both. I pay taxes. My grandfather fought in Vietnam. What about you people? A man's voice boomed from near the counter, bouncing off the shelves stacked with everyday items. He was tall, at least 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a red face that suggested he'd been yelling for a while. His baseball cap was pulled low, but not enough to hide eyes that darted around wildly, looking for support or maybe just an audience. In front of him stood a young woman, maybe in her 20s, one arm wrapped protectively around a little boy who couldn't have been more than 5. The child's face was buried in his mother's jacket, small hands gripping the fabric so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The woman's chin was raised slightly, a quiet defiance despite the fear evident in her rapid breathing. "Please, sir, I just need to pay for my groceries," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite everything. "You need to leave my customers alone," Mr. Green said from behind the counter. The store owner was in his 70s, with silver hair and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He'd built this place from nothing after coming to America, and Officer Chen had heard him say more than once that his store was for everybody. Now he stood there, one hand on the phone he presumably used to call the police, the other stretched out as if he could physically push away the tension in his beloved shop. Around them, 3 other customers huddled by the drink coolers, unsure whether to leave or stay. A teenager was filming with her phone, though she tried to be subtle about it. An older couple held hands tightly, the woman whispering something to her husband. Officer Chen took all this in within seconds, the training kicking in, assessing threats, exits, civilians. The man hadn't noticed her yet, still focused on his target. "Your kind is ruining this neighborhood. Where are you even from? Do you even speak English?" He leaned closer to the woman, his finger jabbing the air inches from her face. The little boy whimpered, and something in Officer Chen's chest tightened. She stepped forward, deliberately letting her boots sound against the linoleum floor. The man's head snapped toward her, and for just a moment, surprise replaced the anger in his expression. "Police. Step back, sir," Officer Chen said, her voice calm but carrying the unmistakable tone of authority. She moved carefully, positioning herself between the man and the young mother. "Finally," the man said, his momentary surprise giving way to a smirk. "Though they sent a real cop, not a—" He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words, but his eyes traveled up and down her uniform in a way that made his meaning clear enough. Officer Chen ignored the implied insult. "Sir, I need you to step back and lower your voice. You're disturbing the peace in this establishment." "Disturbing the peace? That's rich. I'm exercising my freedom of speech. This is still America, last I checked." He pulled out his phone, holding it up as if to record. "Let everyone see how cops treat real Americans these days." Mr. Green sighed heavily. "Officer, he's been here 20 minutes, scaring everyone. I asked him nicely to leave." The man's face darkened. "Shut up, old man. Nobody asked you." Officer Chen felt the situation balancing on a knife's edge. Behind her, the young mother was trying to edge toward the door, her child still clinging to her. The other customers watched wide-eyed, waiting to see what would happen next. "Sir, I need you to move away from these people and calm down," Officer Chen said, keeping her voice level. She stood with her feet slightly apart, balanced and ready. Years on the force had taught her that body language spoke louder than words in moments like this. The man, who would later give his name as Thompson, snorted and took half a step back, but his eyes stayed locked on the young mother and child. "You know what? I've been waiting for someone like you to show up," he said, turning his full attention to Officer Chen. "Let me guess. Affirmative action hire?" 2 boxes checked, woman and... "Sir," Officer Chen cut him off firmly, "your issue right now isn't with anyone's background. It's with disturbing the peace and harassment. I'm asking you to step outside with me so we can talk." Thompson laughed, but there was no humor in it. Just a harsh sound that made the little boy flinch. "Of course you take their side. That's what's wrong with this country now. Police protect them instead of real Americans." Officer Chen felt the familiar burn of anger in her chest, but kept her face neutral. She'd heard it all before, the taunts, the comments about her gender, her heritage. 7 years of it. It still stung, but she'd learned to use that feeling as fuel rather than let it consume her. "There are no sides here, sir. Just people trying to shop and someone causing a disturbance." She gestured toward the door. "Let's continue this outside." Thompson puffed up his chest and took a deliberate step closer to Officer Chen. He was trying to use his height. He had at least 6 inches on her, tilting his chin down to look at her. Classic intimidation tactic. She'd seen it 100 times. "You don't get to tell me where to go," he said, voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "I know my rights." Behind her, Officer Chen could hear the young mother whispering to her child, promising it would be okay. The boy's quiet sniffling filled the otherwise silent store. Even the air conditioning seemed to have paused. "You absolutely have rights," Officer Chen agreed, not backing up an inch despite Thompson's looming presence. "And so does everyone else in this store, including the right to shop without being harassed." Thompson's face flushed darker. I wasn't harassing anyone. I was asking questions. Since when is asking questions harassment? He raised his voice at the end, causing Mr. Green to flinch behind the counter. It becomes harassment when you target people based on how they look, follow them around a store, and make them feel unsafe, Officer Chen explained patiently. Mr. Green asked you to leave his business. That's his right as the owner. And this is how it starts, Thompson said, waving his phone around now, definitely recording. First they come here, then they take over businesses, then they make the rules. And cops like you help them do it. Officer Chen noticed the teenager in the corner was still filming too. 2 cameras. Whatever happened next would be seen by who knows how many people online. She took a deep breath. Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to step outside with me. Thompson's lips curled into something between a smile and a snarl. Or what? You gonna arrest me for speaking the truth? Go ahead. Make yourself famous. I've got friends who'd love to see this. A bead of sweat rolled down Officer Chen's back. The man was trying to create a scene, that much was obvious. But she couldn't just walk away, not with the young mother and child still trapped against the counter, the fearful look in Mr. Green's eyes. I'm not here to be famous, she said quietly. I'm here to do my job. Now we can talk like reasonable people, or this can get complicated. Your choice. For a moment, something flickered in Thompson's eyes. Uncertainty, maybe. But then his gaze slid past Officer Chen to the young mother, and his expression hardened again. These people, he spat, pointing over Officer Chen's shoulder, don't belong here. The radio on Officer Chen's shoulder crackled. Unit 14, backup is 5 minutes out. Thompson's eyes flicked to the radio, then back to her face. His mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile on anyone else. Calling for help already? Can't handle one taxpayer on your own? Officer Chen didn't take the bait. Instead, she glanced toward the young mother. Ma'am, why don't you and your son wait outside until this is resolved? The woman nodded gratefully and began edging toward the door, keeping her body between her child and Thompson. The boy's dinosaur backpack caught on a candy display, sending colorful packets scattering across the floor. Look at that, Thompson sneered, raising his voice again. Destroying property. Typical. The little boy's eyes went wide with fear. His mother quickly scooped him up, whispering reassurances as she hurried outside. The teenager who had been filming lowered her phone slightly, her expression shifting from curiosity to discomfort. That was unnecessary, Officer Chen said, her voice still steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. Something about this guy felt unpredictable, dangerous in a way that went beyond the usual angry citizen. Those candy bars aren't the issue here. You don't decide what the issue is. Thompson shot back, stepping closer. He smelled of cigarettes and that morning's coffee. The issue is this country going to hell because people like you let it happen. Mr. Green moved from behind the counter, stooping to pick up the scattered candy. His hands trembled slightly. Please, no trouble in my store. 30 years, never trouble like this. Stay out of this, old man, Thompson snapped, then turned back to Officer Chen. You see, can barely speak English. These people get everything handed to them. Businesses, housing, special treatment from cops. The older couple by the drink cooler exchanged a look. The woman whispered something to her husband, who nodded and took out his own phone, holding it low but definitely recording now too. 3 cameras. Officer Chen felt sweat trickling down her spine despite the air conditioning. Mr. Green has owned this store for decades, she said calmly. He's a respected member of this community. Community? Thompson repeated, making the word sound dirty. That's the problem with you people. You don't understand what America is supposed to be. He was leaning in now, close enough that Officer Chen could see a tiny scar above his eyebrow, the flecks of gray in his stubble. Sir, I need you to step back now, she said, her hand moving instinctively toward her belt. Not reaching for anything specific, just a trained response to someone entering her space aggressively. Thompson noticed the movement. His eyes lit up with something like victory. What are you going to do, officer? Tase me for speaking my mind? Shoot me for standing my ground? No one's talking about weapons, Officer Chen said firmly. I'm asking you to respect personal space and lower your voice. Oh, now it's about my voice. Thompson was practically shouting, playing to the cameras. First Amendment doesn't apply in here. Is that what they taught you at the academy? The bell above the door jingled as another customer walked in, then immediately stepped back outside upon sensing the tension. Through the glass, Officer Chen could see a small crowd gathering. News traveled fast in this town. The First Amendment protects you from government censorship, Officer Chen explained, fighting to keep her voice level. It doesn't give you the right to harass private citizens or ignore a business owner's request to leave their property. Harassment? Thompson laughed bitterly. That's rich. I ask a few questions and suddenly I'm harassing people. What about my rights as a customer? Your rights end where others begin, Officer Chen said simply. Thompson's face darkened. He jabbed a finger toward her badge. You work for me, you know that? My taxes pay your salary. A familiar line. Every cop heard it eventually. Officer Chen took a slow, measured breath. Her training instructor's words echoed in her mind. When they get personal, stick to procedure. So, final warning. Step back and lower your voice, or what? Thompson interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. What exactly are you going to do about it, Officer Chen? He pronounced her name with exaggerated emphasis, eyes fixed on her nameplate. Something shifted in the air, that electric feeling right before a storm breaks. Officer Chen recognized it from years of handling tense situations. Thompson wasn't going to back down. Not with an audience, not with cameras rolling. His pride wouldn't let him. I asked you a question, Officer, Thompson said, his voice dropping to a growl. What exactly are you going to do? Before Officer Chen could answer, the young mother reappeared at the door, looking anxious. Excuse me, I left my wallet, she began, then froze as Thompson spun toward her. Back for more? He snapped. Didn't get enough attention the first time. The woman's eyes widened. She glanced at her wallet sitting on the counter where she'd left it, then back at Thompson, clearly weighing whether it was worth it. Ma'am, wait outside, please. I'll bring your wallet to you, Officer Chen called, but Thompson was already moving, stepping toward the door with surprising speed. You people are all the same, he hissed, closing the distance to the young mother. Playing the victim, always wanting something for nothing. Officer Chen moved instantly, sliding between them. Sir, bake you pay now. The command in her voice was unmistakable, the voice that had stopped drunk drivers and broken up bar fights. For a heartbeat, Thompson seemed startled by her tone. Then his face twisted with rage. Don't you dare speak to me like that. His hand shot up, finger pointing just inches from Officer Chen's face. You have no right to. I have every right. Officer Chen cut him off, standing her ground despite his looming presence. And you're about to cross a line you can't walk back from. Outside, the little boy was crying, his face pressed against the glass as he watched his mother. The sound seemed to break through the tension for a moment. The young woman glanced back, torn between her child and her wallet. Go to your son, Officer Chen said softly. I'll bring your things out. Thompson let out a harsh laugh. Special service, huh? Bet you wouldn't do that for me. I would help anyone who needed it, Officer Chen replied evenly. That's my job. Your job, Thompson repeated mockingly. Your job is to protect Americans, not bend over backwards for. Every person in this store is under my protection, Officer Chen interrupted, her patience wearing dangerously thin, including you, sir, but especially those you're threatening. Thompson's nostrils flared. Threatening? I haven't threatened anyone. I'm expressing my opinion. This is America, last time I checked. Through the window, Officer Chen could see her backup finally arriving, a patrol car pulling into the lot, lights flashing. Just a minute more. If she could keep this contained for just one more minute. Mr. Green had retreated behind his counter again, hands gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The teenager had backed herself into a corner, still filming but looking increasingly frightened. The older couple stood frozen by the refrigerators. Sir, my colleagues are arriving now, Officer Chen said, nodding toward the window. This is your last chance to step outside voluntarily and discuss this calmly. Thompson followed her gaze, saw the patrol car, and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. So that's how it's going to be. A whole squad for one man speaking his mind. This isn't about free speech, Officer Chen said firmly. It's about harassment and disturbing the peace. Something changed in Thompson's expression then, a hardening, a decision made. In that moment, Officer Chen knew exactly what was coming next. These people, Thompson snarled, suddenly lunging toward the young mother, who still stood frozen in the doorway, don't belong here. Officer Chen moved without thinking, pure training taking over. Her body positioned itself between Thompson and the woman. Her hands came up to create distance. Sir, you're under arrest, she announced clearly, reaching for her handcuffs. Thompson's momentum carried him forward, his larger frame colliding with Officer Chen. She absorbed the impact, keeping her balance as he stumbled back, surprise replacing anger on his face. Don't touch me, he shouted, his voice cracking. I didn't do anything. But it was too late. The line had been crossed. Officer Chen could see her partner rushing toward the door from the patrol car, radio in hand, calling for additional units. Put your hands behind your back, she instructed Thompson, voice steady despite her racing heart. You're under arrest for disorderly conduct, harassment, and resisting an officer. For the first time since she'd walked into the store, Thompson seemed at a loss for words. You're making a huge mistake, Thompson muttered as Officer Chen secured the handcuffs. Not too tight, just enough to be secure. She'd been taught to treat everyone with dignity, even those who showed none to others. Officer Rodriguez, her backup, had entered the store and was helping to control the situation. He was a veteran cop, 15 years on the force, with salt and pepper hair and a calm presence that immediately changed the energy in the room. Got him? Rodriguez asked quietly. Officer Chen nodded, keeping her hand on Thompson's arm. Disorderly conduct, harassment, and resisting. Thompson twisted his head around, face flushed red. I didn't resist. Everyone saw it. They're all recording. Indeed, phones were still raised throughout the store. The teenager in the corner. The older couple by the coolers. Even Mr. Green had his ancient flip phone out now, though he seemed unsure how to use the camera feature. Outside, more people had gathered, faces pressed against the glass. News traveled fast in small towns, especially the bad kind. Officer Chen could see her surgeon's car pulling up now. This would be in her report for hours. Officer Chen saved me, a quiet voice said. The young mother stood near the counter, clutching her wallet and keys. Her eyes were wide, still processing what had happened. He was going to. She stopped, glancing at Thompson, something like fear and anger mixing in her expression. You'll need to give a statement, Rodriguez told her gently. When you're ready. Thompson snorted. Statement about what? I didn't touch anyone. This is harassment, police brutality. Sir, please be quiet, Officer Chen said firmly as she began walking him toward the door. Each step felt heavy. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving her with that familiar hollow feeling in her stomach. As they passed Mr. Green, the old shopkeeper reached out and touched Officer Chen's shoulder briefly. Thank you, he said simply, his eyes shining with something that might have been tears. 30 years, I never. She nodded, understanding what he couldn't put into words. For 30 years, he believed in his little piece of America, his store where everyone was welcome. Thompson had tried to shatter that. Outside, the crowd parted as Officer Chen led Thompson toward the patrol car. The little boy was sitting on a bench, holding a lollipop someone had given him. When he saw his mother following behind, he jumped up and ran to her, wrapping his arms around her legs. Is the mean man going away? The child asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. Officer Chen felt Thompson stiffen beside her. For just a moment, something like shame seemed to cross his face, but it was gone quickly, replaced by the same hardened anger. This isn't over, he muttered as she helped him into the back of Rodriguez's patrol car. I know people, important people. You'll regret this. Officer Chen closed the door without responding to the threat. She'd heard it all before. The claims of connections, the promises of consequences. In 7 years, she'd learned that those who shouted loudest about their powerful friends usually had none. Her sergeant, Officer Powell, approached, notebook already in hand. Powell was in her 50s, with short gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Quite a situation, she said, glancing at Thompson in the car and then back to Officer Chen. You okay? Officer Chen nodded, though her hands were starting to shake slightly, the delayed reaction her training had warned about. Yes, ma'am. Just another day. Powell's expression softened briefly. Take a minute if you need it. Then I'll need a full breakdown. Around them, the crowd was growing, not dispersing. People were talking animatedly, showing each other videos on their phones. Officer Chen caught fragments of conversations. Stood up to him like a boss. Can't believe you would say those things in public. Thank goodness the police came when they did. The young mother was sitting with her son now, giving her statement to another officer who had arrived. She kept looking over at Officer Chen, a silent gratitude in her eyes. Mr. Green had come outside too, passing out free sodas to the officers and witnesses. A small gesture of thanks, his way of reclaiming his role as the neighborhood's caretaker. "Your body camera catch everything?" Powell asked. Officer Chen touched the small device on her uniform. Every word, she confirmed. The camera had been her silent partner, recording what people said and did when they thought no one important was watching. In cases like this, it was often the best witness of all. 3 weeks passed since that afternoon at Green's convenience. Officer Chen sat in the back of the courtroom, watching as Thompson faced the judge. He looked different today, clean-shaven, wearing a button-down shirt and slacks instead of the one t-shirt and jeans from that day. His lawyer, a nervous young man with too many files, kept whispering in his ear. The courtroom was surprisingly full. Word had spread through town. The videos had made sure of that. 4 different angles of the same ugly incident, shared hundreds of times online. Some news websites had picked up the story. Officer stands against hate in small-town store. Officer Chen hadn't wanted the attention. She'd done her job, nothing more. But here she was, watching justice unfold in the wood-paneled courtroom with its American flag and smell of lemon polish. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Rivera entered. She was in her 60s, with steel-gray hair and reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. The kind of judge who had seen it all and wasn't easily impressed by fancy lawyers or excuses. Officer Chen stood with everyone else, catching sight of familiar faces in the crowd. Mr. Green sat in the front row, hands folded neatly in his lap. Behind him was the young mother without her son today. She gave Officer Chen a small nod of recognition. The charges were read: disorderly conduct, harassment with a hate crime enhancement, resisting an officer. Thompson pleaded not guilty despite the video evidence. His lawyer argued he was exercising free speech, that he never physically harmed anyone. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, played the body camera footage. The courtroom went quiet as Thompson's voice filled the room. "These people don't belong here." The young mother stared at her hands. Mr. Green closed his eyes briefly. Officer Chen testified for 20 minutes, describing the events exactly as they happened. No embellishment needed, the truth was damning enough. Thompson's lawyer tried to shake her story, suggesting she had overreacted, that she had been prejudiced against his client from the start. "Officer Chen," the lawyer asked, "lean forward, isn't it true that you put yourself between my client and the other customer before any physical threat occurred?" "Yes," Officer Chen answered simply. "That's called prevention. It's part of our training." A few people in the courtroom chuckled. Judge Rivera's mouth twitched slightly. When the young mother took the stand, her voice shook at first, then grew stronger as she described how Thompson had followed her around the store, how he'd frightened her son, how Officer Chen had protected them. "I was just buying milk and cookies," she said. "My boy had done well at school that day. That's all we were doing." By the end of the day, the verdict seemed inevitable. Guilty on all counts. Judge Rivera didn't hold back in her sentencing remarks. "Mr. Thompson," she said, looking at him over her reading glasses, "the First Amendment is one of our most precious rights. But it has never protected harassment or intimidation. What you did wasn't free speech. It was an attempt to make fellow citizens feel unwelcome in their own community." She sentenced him to 6 months, with 3 suspended, plus community service and a mandatory diversity awareness program. As the bailiff led Thompson away, he didn't look back at the courtroom. The fight seemed to have drained out of him. Outside, rain fell softly on the courthouse steps. Officer Chen pulled up her collar against the chill. A reporter tried to ask her questions, but she politely declined. This wasn't about her. Mr. Green approached, holding a small paper bag. "Donuts," he explained with a smile. "Cliché, I know, but fresh this morning." Officer Chen accepted the bag with a laugh. "Thank you, but you didn't have to." "My store is different now," Mr. Green interrupted, his expression growing serious. People come in and talk about what happened. They say it's good someone stood up. They bring their children and tell them, this is what courage looks like. He patted her arm gently. Not just you. All of us who said no to hate that day. Down the steps, the young mother was waiting, holding an umbrella. We just wanted to say thank you, she said simply. My son still talks about you. He says he wants to be a police officer someday. Officer Chen smiled, feeling something warm unfold in her chest despite the rain. Tell him it's a tough job, but on days like today, it's worth it. As she walked back to her car, radio crackling with a new call, Officer Chen knew the case would fade from public memory eventually. The news would move on to other stories, but something had shifted in their little town, a moment when people had been forced to choose which America they wanted to live in, and they had chosen one where everyone belonged.